Keep left to continue on Fags Road. In a quarter of a mile, turn left onto Great Southwest Road, A30. Take the second left onto Great Southwest Road, A30. Continue on Great Southwest Road for 3/4 of a mile. In a quarter of a mile, take the exit towards Heathrow Airport. Take the exit towards Heathrow Airport. In a quarter of a mile, keep left at the fork to continue towards Southern Perimeter Road. Keep left at the fork. In a quarter of a mile, at the roundabout, take the second exit and stay on Southern Perimeter Road.
During a speech at the weekend. He's told Tonight with Andrew Marr the Prime Minister is referring to exercising freedom. Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe has criticised the government over her detention in Iran. Speaking for the first time publicly, the British-Iranian mother says her release should have happened 6 years ago. And police investigating allegations of parties being held at Downing Street during lockdown have begun to interview witnesses. The Metropolitan Police says to date over 100 questionnaires have been sent out. LBC weather, a dry night for most across the UK, lows at freezing.
LBC. Rex. Even when your pet is being a pickle, it's good to know their healthcare is covered with petsinapickle.co.uk.
Heard about role models? They do amazing online courses for kids, but needed a bit of help from GoDaddy. One day the owner's like, word of mouth isn't cutting it. Why can't people find us online? Then his wife gets an idea. Why don't you use GoDaddy? They've got SEO tools which helps customers find us on searches.
Exit the roundabout onto Southern Perimeter Road. Continue on Southern Perimeter Road for 1.5 miles.
As she goes, did you say something? All the help and tools you need are online. GoDaddy.
From cockapoos to collies, your dog is family. Superdog vitamins are packed with over 21 nutrients from Vitabiotics, the UK's #1 vitamin company. Superdog, available from Superdrug, Ocado and Vitabiotics.com. For #1 verification, visit Vitabiotics.com. Yes, I know you want one.
That's the silky sound of a backing singer who's just found a better way to sell their car using Kazoo. They went online and got an instant guaranteed price that Kazoo won't ship away at. Kazoo can pick up their car from their door and even pay them on the same day. Can you sell your car in a better way? Kazoo, yeah you can.
The bliss after a long walk on a chilly day. Opening the front door and feeling that rush of warm air send a tingle through your cheeks. At Swale Heating, we help you stay warm. It's why we offer smart thermostats from top manufacturers like Worcester Bosch, so you can switch on the heating when you're close to home and always walk into a lovely toasty house. Visit swaleheating.com. Rely on us to keep you warm.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Weekday mornings from 7.
Health Secretary Sajid Javid, were you PM, would you go to Kyiv? Or, as Health Secretary on one of his post-colleagues, would you urge he does go to Kyiv?
I struggle to see how he could provide even more support than we're currently doing. Whereas military is humanitarian, the UK is doing more than
Doesn't it send a heck of a message, though, doesn't it? For the British PM to be seen in Kyiv, presumably shaking hands with or his arm around the Ukrainian president, that's a message for Putin, isn't it?
It's not a good idea to talk about the Prime Minister's future travel plans.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. This is LBC. Tonight with Andrew Marr.
Good evening. Anne Applebaum is a staff writer at The Atlantic and she's author of The Twilight of Democracy. I spoke to her a little earlier and I started by asking her whether it matters that Western leaders are calling Putin a war criminal.
Absolutely correct in that this sounds like the 1930s or the 1940s. To me, it's very specifically reminiscent of two things. One is 1939 when the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland and the Baltic states, and they arrested all of the teachers and doctors and policemen and deported them to the east. Again, did much the same thing in 1945 when they came into Eastern Europe at the end of the war. And this is what is happening in Eastern Ukraine is exactly that. So the identification of social leaders, civic leaders.
In 1/4 mile, at Western Perimeter Road roundabout, take the first exit and stay on Southern Perimeter Road.
And precisely out of the Soviet playbook. There's no question that that's what they're doing. So yes, I think it does matter to call it a war crime, and it will make a difference in how we think and speak about Putin in the future to hold him to account in some international context. But you are also right to point at the fact that these things do mean what they
Exit the roundabout onto Southern Perimeter Road.
in Syria, when there were clearly war crimes committed in Syria.
In 200 yards, at the roundabout, take the second exit onto Airport Way, A3113.
And the idea that, we would hold people to account, that there would be no genocide, that there would be no, mass mass murder of civilians during a conflict. A lot of this has lost traction because none of this was enforced, and there's been impunity. There's a tradition now of established over the past decade of dictators getting away with this. And I should say it's not an accident, because Putin, as well as the Chinese, maybe even the Chinese more so, have really been chipping away at those kinds of institutions for a decade.
And so Putin, maybe if he's still there in 5 years' time, who knows, he's in the Kremlin, he's called a war criminal, but in practical terms that doesn't really mean anything to him or the people around him.
No, it might annoy them, and
Exit the roundabout onto Airport Way.
language, and they will go on attacking that language.
Continue on Airport Way for half a mile.
Things that the Russians have and the Chinese both have long liked to do is attack this language as some kind of Western, imperialist language. These are your values, not our values, and there's nothing universal about them. And they will go on doing this. But I think it's not wrong to use the language, because it does have an echo in some other places.
Let's talk about how we got here. You've been using the term Putinism. You were one of the very first people to use it back in about 2008, I think.
In a quarter of a mile, at the roundabout, take the 4th exit onto the M25 slip road to M4, M40.
To the ancient tradition of Tsarist autocracy, and it's yet another cycle of the long understood Russian history.
So there was a phenomenon called Putinism that was fairly unique, and it reached its peak in about 2008, 9, 10.
What was it?
And this was a system that they described as managed democracy. And so essentially it was fake democracy. So there were fake political parties, there were elections that had some impact and mattered in some places, particularly local elections, but essentially they were stage managed. Essentially the economy was stage managed. So there were some appearances of the free market, and there were some spaces where there was free trade and so on, but really it was all controlled from above by oligarchs.
So a kind of Potemkin democracy, the facade of democracy, but behind that autocracy.
Yes, but the facade was important, and they cared about it because that
Exit the roundabout onto the slip road.
legitimacy. I mean, why should he be president of Russia, and why should he be, a billionaire surrounded by other billionaires? Why did they deserve all this? And so it created this elaborate facade that was designed to give them this kind of legitimacy. And they had elections, and they had sort of television programs that almost looked like Western television programs, but those were also, and it was really, a lot of this came from a sort of old KGB tradition of steering or managing things from behind the scenes.
And you said that was the case.
That was the
Things
case.
have changed. When did things change, and why?
Continue for half a mile.
It began to change a little bit in 2011 when there were genuine mass demonstrations in Moscow, and Putin became, for the first time, I think, afraid that the management wasn't going to continue to work. And over the last couple of years, they've deteriorated very dramatically. And in the last 3 weeks, it's gone. So whatever vestiges of liberal or independent media have now been shut down.
In a quarter of a mile, merge onto M25.
Country, all kinds of civic institutions and organizations have been shut down, including, the Memorial Society, which was a great historical society that collected evidence on the crimes of Stalinism and went back to the 1980s. And so so now we're seeing something that looks much more like traditional Stalinist or Tsarist democracy.
You mentioned Stalinism.
Continue on M25 for 1 mile.
And pull out volumes that were Stalin's and look at Stalin's annotations. To what extent do you think he's now modelling himself on Stalin?
I don't think this is a direct model on Stalin. I mean, he's sometimes critical of the Soviet Communist Party, and which he thinks was bad for Russia in various ways. But certainly the KGB tactics of that era, whether it was the NKVD then, he's using to full effect. And so he must know that he's doing that. He also did something a few days ago. He spoke about the need for...
In a quarter of a mile, at junction 15, use the left lane to take the M4 exit to Reading, Slough.
This is how Stalin discussed getting rid of his enemies. So he's using this, he's evoking Stalinism, I think, to frighten Russians. He's trying to make them remember that era.
Lead the body politic.
Yes.
You mentioned the KGB, now the FSB.
Use the left lane to exit at junction 15, then keep left at the fork.
Because there was a report that the current head of the FSB was already being lined up to replace Putin.
Keep left at the fork.
Arrests of senior FSB or KGB operatives. So something is going on in Moscow at the moment, isn't it?
Continue on M4 for 1.5 miles.
In the Kremlinology stage of understanding Russia, where, we're looking at tea leaves and shadows on the wall, and I isolated from the rest of Moscow than he used to be. You know, he used to have interactions with all kinds of people. People would meet him. There was gossip about him. You would know things about him. That's all changed. He became very afraid of COVID. He spent 2 years essentially in a bunker. You couldn't go and see him unless you were in quarantine for 2 weeks. And he became very cut off from the rest of society. You can still see him at those long tables. Either he's afraid of catching COVID from his defense minister, or he's afraid of being assassinated, or maybe both. And
so you begin to ask yourself if this war is part of long COVID.
There is an argument that says that one of the greatest political impacts of COVID may have been the 2-year isolation of Putin. It is very possible.
So let's look about how this could end, because we'll have Putin sitting in the Kremlin. He's got these devastating Kinzhal missiles that we've got no response to in the West. He's got nuclear weapons. He's got a range of other horrific weapons. His conventional army is getting bogged down, making very little progress even today, as they're very good at shelling civilians, very good at shelling hospitals, very good at shelling schools, or whatever it might be. They're not so good at fighting the Ukrainian army effectively. So how does this end?
So there are 2 or 3 scenarios. Again, I can't tell you how it will end. The best scenario is that
in a quarter of a mile, keep right to stay on M4.
Withdraws his troops, which are not able to win a victory. Ukraine remains intact. It remains a sovereign democracy. And perhaps some papering over, or there's some Ukrainians agree to remain neutral, or there's a border change. I would not dictate that to the Ukrainians, but if they want to do that as a way of ending the conflict, then
keep right to stay on M4.
Remember that because he controls the entire narrative, he's not told the Russians that he's at war in Ukraine even. He can say, right, we had this special military operation and now we had a victory. And I think that may have been the purpose of using this phrase, special military operation, so that he could end this. So that's the best scenario. And then there are some worse scenarios. I mean, the really bad scenarios that he wins the war, he conquers Ukraine, 1 million people die, there's mass arrests, and we have a bloodbath in the middle of Europe. That's another way it could end. I'm hoping that Western support for Ukraine will prevent that.
Happening. Let's look at the West more generally, because in your book, The Twilight of Democracy, you start with a party you were giving New Year's Eve 1999, and all those friends of yours this is in Poland, all your Polish friends, half of them you don't speak to now because they have moved to the extreme or far right. And there's clearly something a bit like fascism beginning to spread, certainly through Eastern Europe, and you look at some of the pro-Putin rallies inside Russia, and they look very, very like fascist rallies. There's the Azov battalion on the Ukrainian side as well, neo-Nazis, many of them as well. What is going on in Central Europe?
So I would say this is not a Central European problem. I would say it is a problem for liberal democracy more generally. I would include the United States, Britain, France, Spain, Italy, and Germany in this same conversation. So I don't think this is a Central European issue.
So there are, as it were, pro-Putinists in this country and
yes.
in Washington and across the United States.
Yes, I mean, Nigel Farage had a television program on Russia Today, for years. In the United States, we have a number of openly pro-Putin commentators, some of whom are backtracking this week. There's a famous Fox News presenter, Tucker Carlson, who has been, openly pro-Russian, and I think it comes from a similar phenomenon as the far right, in that it's people who feel disgust with their own country. They don't like modern America. It's too diverse, or they don't like something about it. They see in autocracy, they see a kind of political alternative.
And they look at the sort of Putinist regime close to the Russian Orthodox Church, but also saying that homosexuality, gay rights is Western propaganda trying to suppress the population and all of that. And I think, actually, I agree with quite a lot of that.
Right. I mean, of course, much of that was, literally rubbish. I mean, Russia's not a particularly religious country at all. Something like 5% of Russians have ever read a Bible. Nevertheless, Putin did a very good job of selling himself as a leader of a white Christian nation, and therefore other people who wished to live in white Christian nations found him to be admirable. I mean, the sort of junior version of this is Viktor Orban, who does a sort of less toxic version of exactly the same thing.
In 2 miles, at junction 6, take the A355 exit to Slough Central.
Independent institutions, trying to shut down independent thought, controlling universities. universities. And in the case of Putin, he really did establish over time a system of full control and manipulation. Not everybody has been able to achieve quite that much. Not all the other autocrats have. But the admiration for this political system, for people who feel disgust or anger at liberal democracy, is certainly there. And of course, in some cases, there's a financial element as well.
Anne Applebaum, it's been a glorious, gentle spring day here at Westminster, but there's some dark clouds swirling around us. Thanks very much for coming in to talk.
Thank you.
And that was Anne Applebaum. She's a staff writer at The Atlantic. In the course of this little programme, one of the things I'm trying to do is to bring you some of the sharpest and brightest writers on specific subjects there are out there. And day after day, we seem to be able to do that, and Anne Applebaum is certainly a very good example of that. I was reflecting on what she was saying, and it is true that in these very, very comparatively wealthy Western societies, there is at least a minority of people who just hate the way we live, who hate the over-sexualization of society, are very, very leery about gay rights, who hate foreigners, who hate outsiders, who want to go back to a much more stern, kind of orthodox religious societies that they were in before. And you certainly see that across, I was talking about earlier on about Central Europe. The Law and Justice Party in Poland would be a good example. The supporters of Viktor Orban in Hungary, another good example. The Azov Battalion who are fighting the Russians. And so they're kind of on our side. They're supposed to be heroes, but actually they are also neo-Nazis. So you sometimes wonder, which side are we on? Are we on the side of the neo-Nazis? Is that something that we're worried about? Now, of course, they are essentially fighting for the freedom of their country.
In a quarter of a mile, at junction 6, take the A355 exit to Slough Central.
In the middle of the fog of war, to keep looking at ourselves, it is never the case that on our side of the world we are all good and all right, and on the other side of the world they are all evil. There are plenty of good Russians and plenty of Russians protesting against the war, and we have to remember to keep complex.
Exit at junction 6.
That's what Anne Applebaum was there to do. I think very well indeed. Now, coming up, I'm going to be speaking to the political journalist and writer Michael Crick. He's author.
In a quarter of a mile, at the roundabout, take the third exit onto Tuns Lane, A355.
Applebaum there talking about Nigel Farage. You are listening to Andrew Marr on LBC, and the time now is 6:45.
Coming up at 7 on LBC, Ian Dale.
As predicted on this show last week, there are rumours that Boris Johnson wants to visit Kyiv in person. Has he lost his marbles?
Ian Dale on LBC. Right now, prices are higher if you're running a car. And very soon, higher at home when you run a bath. So wouldn't it be great to get one or two bills lower? Go Compare's Operation Saving the Nation could help you save money for what you really want. And it starts with a quick comparison of your insurance, broadband, credit cards and more. To win a £2,000 voucher towards whatever you're saving for, thanks to Go Compare, head to lbc.co.uk.
Booking a hotel can be a bit of a hassle. The fake reviews, the endless options, not to mention the fear of getting a bad deal. But with
Exit the roundabout onto Tuns Lane.
Because with us, you know exactly what you're getting. Like great value family rooms in over 800 locations, plenty of parking.
Continue on A355 for 1 mile.
Even the fussy ones. So you can family trip without any of the faff. Premier Inn. Rest easy. Only available to book at premierinn.com.
Forget the traffic and zoom straight into the city centre. Travel from London to Leeds for £30 each way. It's amazing where an LNER train will take you. Like the best gigs in town! Dinners with Dad. Shopping in the Corn Exchange. Book direct at lner.co.uk or via the LNER app. 7,500 seats available at stated price, booked up to 14 days before travel. Subject to availability between Monday to Thursday. Off-peak services only.
We got boosted for the team. Chris, pass the ball. I'm on.
We got boosted to get together.
How have you been? You been alright?
Gosh, I haven't seen you guys.
I got boosted because I don't want to get really ill.
We got boosted. Join us. Let's get protected.
Over time, 2 doses do not give you enough protection against COVID-19. Get boosted now at nhs.uk/COVID vaccination.
Tonight with Andrew Marr on LBC.
And the time is very nearly 6:48. Joining me in the studio is the political journalist and writer Michael Crick. Always a man who cheers you up He's the author of One Party After Another, The Disruptive Life of Nigel Farage. And Michael, we were just talking about Nigel Farage a few moments ago with Anne Applebaum, and she was citing him as one of the Putin supporters long term. He's been on Russia Today, etc., etc. Is that a bad thing to say?
He did do a few appearances in Russia.
So they
including a very glamorous woman who was fronted the main TV station. And I can remember her saying to me, I mean, we were talking about gay rights, because that was one of the issues at the Olympics. And she was saying, but this whole thing is just made up by the West. I said, what do you mean, this whole thing? She said, all this gay stuff is just made up by the West. And they're trying to pump it into Russia to persuade Russians to become gay, therefore not to have children, and suppress the Russian birth rate, and then we'll die out. It's a plot. And I was like you are now, I was laughing. Yeah. And she was entirely serious. And I thought, there is an alternative reality we what not of.
Yeah. And there are no gay people in Russia.
No gay people in Russia. Yeah. Let me talk about another big subject of the evening. Oliver Dowden, Conservative Party chairman, came in to talk about Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson said a couple of extraordinary things at the weekend in his speech to the Tories up in Blackpool. He said, first of all, that there was an equivalence between the Brexit referendum and the fighters in Ukraine, both fighting for freedom. And that offended a lot of people. And I suggested at the top of the show that he did it entirely intentionally to shift the conversation back towards Brexit. Do you agree?
I think that's probably right, actually, yes. But on the way, he's offended the Ukrainians, he's offended the rest of the EU. Maybe he doesn't care about that anymore, but he blooming well should do in the current circumstances. And he's offended at least, I would say, at least half the population, probably more. I haven't seen the latest figures for the number of people that regret Brexit and regret voting for Brexit, but it's got to be over half now. And if he's going to carry on that line, then he's going to...
In 200 yards, turn left onto Buckingham Avenue.
...between now and the next general election. I think it was a blooming stupid thing for him to say, and I think...
Turn left onto Buckingham Avenue.
Deep down, think the same. And the other thing he said, of course, was that Keir Starmer, the Labour Party, would haul up the white flag to Putin. Now, all the way through this, Keir Starmer...
Continue on Buckingham Avenue for 3/4 of a mile.
Shoulder to shoulder with the Conservatives, always 100% behind them, being supportive, and this is the thanks he gets. And part of me thinks, Boris Johnson, you just can't help yourself.
Of course, I mean, if it's been Jeremy Corbyn, well, things might be very different, because Jeremy Corbyn's line has always been, well, we need to negotiate, we need to achieve peace, and all of that. But you're absolutely right. On this, Starmer has been resolutely behind the government, and in some ways tougher than the government. So it's ridiculous. But at the end of the day, I mean, Boris Johnson is trying to make himself into a war leader. He's having a reasonably successful war, in my view. And the whole issue of Partygate, which re-emerged today when we heard, actually I thought it was quite shocking news that they've only just started interviewing people in Downing Street. What have they been doing for the last few weeks? I would have thought they would have
Filling in forms.
They haven't found anybody yet, it turns out. But it brings it back, and it reminds us all about Partygate. How this will work out and whether Partygate will eventually come and bite him, I don't know. All I would say is that if you take my adult lifetime, which is roughly the same as yours,